Welcome to this narrated PowerPoint from the Speech and Language Therapy Training Team, an introduction to speech, language and communication needs at secondary school. This PowerPoint is designed as an introduction to speech, language and communication needs, often abbreviated to SLCN, and how to support the students that you work with. We will start by thinking about the different aspects of speech, language and communication and the impacts of difficulties in these areas. Then we will cover 6 key areas of language and communication skills, including how to identify difficulties in each area and supportive strategies. At the end of the PowerPoint, we will look at communication passports and signpost you to further resources and screening tools that you can use to identify SLCN. As mentioned before, SLCN stands for Speech, Language and Communication Needs. As speech and language therapists, we often use the terms speech, language and communication in very specific ways. If you have concerns about a child's speech sound production or about stammering or stuttering, please contact the Speech and Language Therapy Service. We also have additional free training you can access in these areas. Today we are focusing on language and communication skills, as the vast majority of speech sound difficulties will have resolved by the time children start secondary school. Language refers to talking and understanding. At secondary school, we expect children and young people to have a range of appropriate vocabulary to support subject-specific learning, have organised sentences and narratives to demonstrate understanding and express their views, understand instructions from teaching staff, have the emotional language to support emotional literacy, and use verbal reasoning skills to analyse information and learning. Communication refers to how we interact with others. We would expect secondary school students to know how to adapt communication styles to suit the situation and audience, to follow non-verbal rules of communication, including listening and taking conversational turns, use language to persuade, negotiate, predict and account for consequences, and use language to enable conflict resolution and collaboration, as well as use alternative forms of communication where words are difficult. It is important to identify and address SLCN because of the potential impact on a young person. Research studies have found that 81% of students with emotional and behavioural disorders have undiagnosed language difficulties, and more than 50% of students who are excluded from school have undiagnosed SLCN. Thinking longer term, research has also shown that 60% of young offenders have SLCN, and in another study, 88% of unemployed young men were found to have language difficulties. Why is communication important? Language and communication development can often be thought of as more relevant when children are young. However, language and communication skills continue to develop throughout the teenage years as the learning demands and social demands increase. For example, students need the ability to use language for negotiation, compromise, resolving conflict, developing relationships, and for managing and regulating their emotions. Being an effective communicator is important for school attainment, behaviour, emotional and social development, and readiness for the workplace. The way that adults interact and communicate with students will support them to develop their language and communication skills and access learning. Without support, students with SLCN will struggle to understand instructions, access the curriculum, manage their own behaviour and reach attainment levels that could otherwise be within their grasp. Therefore, it is vital that we support and guide their communication development. Speech, language and communication needs is an umbrella term that is used to cover a range of needs. Many children and young people who have other SEN labels or diagnoses also have SLCN. There are some groups of children and young people who are at much higher risk than others, for example those with DLD, learning difficulties and autism. Other diagnoses that can result in SLCN are dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD and SEMH. Children with SLCN often have more than one difficulty or diagnosis, but not all children with SLCN will have a diagnosis. Many children go undiagnosed and unidentified. There is great value to describing the needs that a child has rather than the label attached to them. For more information around developmental language disorder, you could access our narrated PowerPoint, What is DLD? We will now move on to discuss 6 areas of language and communication. The first area we will focus on is attention and listening. By the time that students reach secondary school, we expect them to have well-developed listening and attention skills. However, we know this is not the case for all students. Students with attention and listening difficulties will find it hard to focus their attention for long periods of time. They may display as being very active, either moving on to another activity or talking about a different topic. Alternatively, they may appear to daydream or zone out a lot. Students may also have difficulty shifting their attention from one activity and back again. This means that they have difficulty with two-channeled attention, and they may not be able to focus on more than one thing at a time, i.e., they may not be able to listen to information while they are writing. Here are some strategies to support attention and listening in the classroom at secondary school. Use specific praise, mentioning the good listening skills you want to see. For example, thank you for looking at the board and sitting quietly. Task planners. These break activities down into smaller steps, helping the student to focus on each discrete part of the activity, with fewer opportunities to become confused and therefore distracted. The student can be encouraged to tick each step as they complete it to help them independently monitor their own progress within the task. There is an example of this on the next slide. Minimize distractions in your classroom. Consider the noise, visual distraction, and the distraction created by their peers. Use a clear timetable to show the student what tasks to expect during their day. The standard timetable issued to students may need to be reviewed with specific students to ensure they know how to read it. You may need to redesign it to make it easier for a student, for example, changing the layout or adding colours or symbols. During individual lessons, explain the lesson structure to the student so they know what to expect. Avoid asking students to listen for more than 10 minutes without talking or doing something or thinking about something specific. Otherwise, they may disengage with what is being said. You can introduce movement breaks either by specifically asking students to get up and move around, or by using other tasks such as taking a note to reception, bringing something to the front of the class, etc. The language required for each student will depend on their specific language level. To make your language easier to understand, use shorter, simple sentences, rephrase, and chunk information. Avoid using lots of new vocabulary at once and use visuals to support your meaning where possible. Here is an example of a task planner. It has spaces for what the task is, what the student needs, what they have to do and what to do when they've finished, and also what to do if they get stuck, which is a nice one for developing self-help skills. Moving on to our second area of communication, understanding and reasoning. By secondary age, many students will be aware of their difficulties and may try to mask or cover up these either through disruptive behaviour or copying what others are doing. Indicators that students might have difficulties understanding spoken language include: they may have difficulty following instructions. This could also be a sign of having difficulties with auditory memory, as the student can't hold the instructions in their memory for long enough to act on them. After an instruction to the group, they may look around the room at what other pupils are doing before they start the activity. They may not have understood the instruction and are using their peers' actions as clues to help them carry out the activity. Many students will be reluctant to ask for help as they don't want to draw attention to themselves, so they may try to copy what others are doing instead. Students may also appear to stop concentrating when you're talking to them in a group. This might be because they may not be able to understand what you're saying and so switch off. Think about listening to a long-winded list of directions. How many of us switch off halfway through as we don't understand the geographical references and we're sure that we won't remember anyway? When you ask them a question, they may appear to be answering a different question. This shows that they have not understood what you have said, and they may be answering how they have interpreted the question, or they may parrot what you've said but without understanding it. Limited vocabulary knowledge compared with other children of their age, for example, not understanding words that are used in exam questions such as compare, contrast, or discuss. They may appear forgetful or may take time to decipher or process more complex or longer sentences. This may be to do with difficulty holding the information in their memory or with processing the language that they're hearing. They may show disruptive behaviour or become quiet and withdrawn. For example, they may not volunteer answers in class. Disruptive behaviour may be because they're unable to understand what's being asked of them, are frustrated, or are frightened of failing. In activities that involve a lot of talking, like class discussions, they may be quiet and not join in, or they may join in but give inappropriate answers. Some useful strategies to support your students' understanding are listed here. Students often get lost in detail, particularly if they don't have the big picture in their heads, so give an overview of what you're going to talk about. A visual cue would be really useful here. For example, if you're talking about volcanoes, explain this while showing some pictures of some volcanoes. Allow students extra time for processing. This will aid learning. You may need to count to 10 in your head after you've said something before moving on to the next thing. Students with memory or processing difficulties may look like they're not paying attention, i.e. not looking at you or looking at the ceiling or out of the window, but they're often trying to process the information presented to them. Use visuals to encourage students to become more active learners. There are some examples of this on the next slide. Break information down into small segments, leaving pauses for the students to process what you've said. This is called chunking. Make questions easier by making them more concrete or relating questions to personal experience or asking questions about very recent events or objects that are present, and using familiar vocabulary is also helpful. Link new words to vocabulary that the student already knows. Ask the student to explain what you have said, rather than just asking them, "Do you understand?" This will give you a good idea of how much or to what depth they have understood you. Be aware of students simply parroting back your words. Check understanding through more detailed questioning. We need to teach students to actively listen and to monitor their own comprehension, i.e. to be aware of when they have not heard or not understood and know strategies to remember information. As adults, we are usually very aware of when we have not heard something and will have strategies to help us, for example, to ask for help, or we'll look at what other people are doing, for example. For our students, they may be very used to not understanding instructions or not knowing what to do and not having any strategies to help themselves. Using a visual like the one on the slide can help them to pinpoint why they haven't heard or understood the information. This strategy involves asking the student to explain what they have to do. For example, where do you need to go? What will you ask for? This encourages independence as they have to give an answer and can't just rely on being told again. Give them praise for remembering some of the instructions or for trying to remember. You can also use visual or written reminders to develop independence. On the right-hand side, the red, amber and green cards can also be used to develop comprehension, monitoring and independence. You could laminate and make this into a prism where the students can turn it around to show how they're feeling about the work. As speech and language therapists, we often recommend using visual support for students with SLCN. This can reduce memory load as the pictures can stay there rather than trying to retain all the information in their auditory memory, help them to understand the language used, promote independent skills as they don't need to ask an adult each time, help visualize more abstract concepts. Visual support can feel less appropriate for older students, but we all rely on using visuals throughout our everyday lives. For example, diaries and calendars, road signs, safety information and instructions. Therefore, it is still appropriate to use visual support with students, but you might want to use photos or diagrams more than more basic symbols. These are also really useful for students who are learning English as an additional language, especially those who have only started learning English since starting at secondary school. Graphic organisers are another resource that can be very useful for students with SLCN. It helps students to see information that they are given. You can use different graphic organisers for different topics or subjects. An example of a common graphic organiser is a Venn diagram. These are a couple of examples. As you can see, they're very simple and are just a slightly more visual way of representing key information. The blank language scheme explains how we develop our understanding of abstract language. The first step is level 1, where we answer simple naming questions. The last step is level 4, where we use our verbal reasoning skills to justify, reason and explain. We would usually expect students in secondary school to understand questions at each of these levels, although some students will find abstract language skills difficult to master. Once you know what kind of questions a student can answer, you can support them to develop their verbal reasoning skills by asking them questions from the next level. So, for example, a student currently working at level 3 could be supported to progress by asking them questions at level 4. If they find it difficult to answer, you could offer them a choice of 2 answers to scaffold them. As an example, let's say your student in English was learning about The Hobbit and they work at blank level 3. At level 3 you could ask, what happened when Gandalf arrived? Or, how did Bilbo feel? At level 4 you could ask, why did Bilbo agree to go on the adventure? Or, how do you know that Gollum is angry? The third area of communication we will explore is vocabulary. For students with SLCN, or those who have language difficulties, it is likely that they will have a significantly reduced vocabulary. This will affect their understanding and use of vocabulary. Students with a word-finding difficulty might use the wrong words for things or use a word that sounds similar. For example, calling a lobster a crab, which is a semantic error, or calling a lobster a lister, which is a phonological or a sound error. They may also seem to be struggling to express themselves. For example, they may know a word but appear not to be able to access it, resulting in lots of fillers, hesitations, gesticulation, or talking around the words. Word-finding difficulties are a spectrum that we all experience. Think of when a name is on the tip of your tongue, for example. But for students with SLCN, this may happen on a regular basis, which can lead to misunderstandings in conversation or disrupt the flow of their spoken or written language. Students with a weaker vocabulary may use very general words when a more specific word would be better. For example, they may use thing or it instead of more specific vocabulary, or they may overuse the same descriptive language, for example, describing everything as good instead of a range of descriptive language. One way to develop understanding is through vocabulary teaching. The brain is like a filing cabinet or computer system full of words. Some people have systems with neatly arranged folders and subfolders, and all the documents are clearly named, so it's very obvious where they are. In these systems, it's very easy to navigate to the correct folder, find the right subfolder, and then open the correct document. Other people's systems look like this. You will need to spend a long time looking through all the files to find the one you want. It's the same with vocabulary. When we have a robust word storage system, then words are stored neatly in categories and well linked together, meaning that we can easily and quickly access the word that we want. For students with a weak vocabulary, these words are not well stored, and so it takes much longer to process spoken information and to use the right words when we need them. When defining words, it can be hard to give a detailed explanation without using too much complicated vocabulary. The Collins Co-Build Dictionary is a really good resource for simple explanations. The top definition here is from the Co-Build Dictionary. There is a traditional definition at the bottom of this slide. As you can see, even a definition for a very simple word such as cat is very complex. If you find the online Collins Dictionary, you can see the Co-Build definition as well as the traditional definition and other useful information, for example, pronunciation and picture examples. This slide shows an example of a word map. Word maps can help students to start organising the words they already know whilst adding to their vocabulary. There are lots of different templates available. The main aim with pre-teaching vocabulary is to store new words securely with links to other words they already know. Even as adults, we use lots of strategies to help us remember vocabulary. We do not just rely on the meaning of the word, the semantics, but we also use the sound properties of the word, for example, the initial sound, the length of the word, etc., to help cue us in. Word maps focus on the semantic or the meanings of words, categories, antonyms, synonyms, etc., phonology or the sounds of the words, and meta-knowledge, world understanding of a word. On this word map, colour coding has also been used. Red is for what is said, green is for what it means. Grammar is the next area of communication to explore. Children and young people can make a range of mistakes with their spoken grammar. They may omit the ending of words. This will likely have an impact on how well they can talk outside of the here and now, as they will likely be missing off tense endings. This can make it hard to understand what they're telling you about. They may miss out small parts of a sentence as well, such as the and ah. They may put words together in the wrong order, or they may miss out important information and key words from their sentence. Their language may sound immature compared with other children of their age. Here are some strategies to support spoken grammar. Give students time to formulate their response. Many students with SLCN will need extra time to formulate a response. By giving them extra time, you are letting them formulate a more coherent answer. Letting them discuss their answer with a teaching assistant or learning support assistant first can help them to generate their response before having to speak in front of the class. For some students, remembering their answer will also be difficult, so the adults can also support them to recall it. Use sentence starters. For example, I think, I disagree, in my opinion, I'm not sure because. Many students benefit from sentence starters, as this reduces processing load and allows them to focus more on the content of their answer. There are some examples in the yellow box at the bottom of the slide. These could be written or visual cues, or you could start off the sentence and pause for the student to fill in the rest. Repeat sentences back accurately. When students make an error, it's helpful for an adult to repeat the sentence back accurately. This is to ensure the student hears an accurate grammar model. The student should not be told that they said it wrong, and the student should not be asked to repeat the sentence back. Use underlining to draw attention to missing grammatical structures. You could write the student's sentence down, underline the grammatical structure they missed, for example, plural s, or past tense, word endings, little words like is and the. This is a visual way to support the student to monitor their own use of grammatical structures. Gap sheets could also be helpful. Provide the student with fill in the gap worksheets. These give the students a good model of accurate grammatical structures such as past tense, conjunctions and pronouns. Barrier games are also helpful. These are games where there is a physical barrier between yourself and the child. One person is the speaker and the other one is the listener. One person has a completed object or picture, while the other needs to create a matching object or picture. The overall aim of the game is that when the barrier is removed, the pictures or objects match. The barrier ensures that only language is used to convey meaning. By letting the student give you instructions, they practice giving instructions. You can then prompt them to rephrase sentences or offer clarification, helping them develop their repair strategies and more accurate grammar. The fifth area of communication on our list is narrative. Students may find verbal narratives tricky. For example, they may find it hard to sequence information when retelling an event or a story, or they may find it difficult to use connectives and sequencing words to link ideas and sentences together. These difficulties will be more obvious and noticeable when students are upset, anxious, or under pressure. For example, a student who is usually able to tell you about their weekend may not be able to explain what happened earlier during a fight at break time. These difficulties will all impact on a student's written language skills. Strategies to support narrative skills. Visual scaffolding. Use visual aids such as story planners to help them structure their story. For example, who was there, where they were, what happened, etc. There are some examples of these on the next couple of slides. Retell familiar stories and events before working on creating novel stories. Practice sequencing ideas using pictures or photos. You can create picture sequences for any story. For example, you could use photos to tell a story about what happened on a school trip to the theatre. Develop understanding of time concepts. There are a number of resources to support understanding of time concepts. We will signpost these at the end of the presentation. Time concepts are abstract and therefore can be difficult for students to understand or use accurately. Use spidergrams to support descriptive vocabulary. Spidergrams support students to explore new adjectives. There will be an example on a slide shortly. Reflect back. Take some of the pressure off the student and reflect back on what you have heard. This will then give the student the opportunity to fill in gaps or to clarify points that were not interpreted accurately. Here is an example of a story planner. It can be used for spoken or written narratives. Here is another example of a story planner. This is an example of a spidergram which supports the use of adjectives. Here the word being explored is forest. The final area of communication we will cover today is social communication. You may have heard this phrase before or perhaps hear it being referred to as pragmatics. Difficulties in these areas mean difficulties with social skills that may be related to a specific diagnosis, for example, autism or attachment disorder, or could be part of SLCN, but the students find it hard to moderate their language and communication style for different audiences. Students with social communication difficulties may find it difficult to follow social rules and conventions and may have difficulties initiating and maintaining conversations. They may also find it difficult to take turns in conversation, for example, talking about the same topic of conversation over and over and/or change the topic frequently. Or they may only speak to a small number of people in school, if at all. They may find it difficult to understand non-literal language, such as metaphors and sarcasm, which they take literally. There can be an overlap between these social communication difficulties and the abstract language difficulties that we discussed earlier in relation to blank levels. They may have poor eye contact, not appearing to look at you or peers when talking with them, and they may not use much expression in their face or their tone of voice. Students may also have difficulties with making and maintaining friendships due to difficulties understanding social rules, working cooperatively due to difficulties with understanding the perspectives of others, regulating emotions due to less awareness of their emotions and how to regulate them. Many students need specific teaching of these skills. Complying with rules due to rigid thinking. If they don't agree with a rule, then they will find it hard to accept that they still have to comply with it. Some students may avoid adult attention, whilst others may be very demanding of attention as they want to discuss or challenge things that they don't agree with. Accepting mistakes. Thinking flexibly, for example, disruptive or difficult behaviour due to difficulties understanding how to use language flexibly for a range of purposes. As the behaviour difficulties are more obvious, they may mask underlying social communication difficulties. For example, they may seem pedantic or stubborn due to rigidness of thought. Difficulties with rigid thinking can also make it hard to cope with change, which again can lead to anxiety or challenging behaviour. They may also have difficulty taking responsibility for choices. These difficulties may result in students having disruptive or difficult behaviour and difficulties coping with change. Then you may also see avoiding or demanding adult attention and poor self-awareness and self-esteem. As well as learning about general social communication, students with these difficulties may need to be explicitly taught conversation expectations. These are most easily taught within group settings, e.g. a social skills group or another group like Lego Club. These expectations include not interrupting, staying on topic, not talking for too long, not saying things that are culturally or socially unacceptable, responding to questions, and asking questions. Make sure that behaviour rules are really explicit. This can be supported by the use of visuals. Use positive language as much as possible to reduce any confusion. See the examples on the next slide for more detail. Consistency is key. Students need to know that the rules are the same in all lessons and activities. Again, use of consistent visuals can support this. Do not imply information through non-verbal communication. For example, don't rely on facial expression to convey information. For example, if you want the student to be quiet, you need to say this as well as using your stop talking facial expression. Avoid the use of metaphors and non-literal language, as this will be much more difficult for many students to understand. Some neurodivergent students, for example those with autism, may require different expectations in terms of social communication. You can discuss this with them and others to ensure that neurodivergence is understood and respected. You may like to investigate the idea of masking within the autistic community and explore the expectations that we have for those individuals. Here is an example of some classroom rules that could be used consistently across all classrooms as a visual support. Finally, let's move on to communication passports. Communication passports are documents that give an overview of a student's SLCN and strategies used to support them. They are particularly useful in secondary schools as students move across lots of different classrooms and teaching staff throughout the school day. They are written from the student's perspective and should be quick and easy for the supporting adults to read. Where at all possible, these documents are written with the student. Let's have a look at an example. Here's an example of a communication passport. You can see that it has information about the student's likes, what they're good at, their communication needs, and strategies to support them. We're now going to signpost you to some further helpful resources. Here are some screening tools that you might find helpful to use in your settings to identify what SLCN a young person is presenting with. This can be a really helpful thing to complete to determine whether a referral to speech and language therapy is appropriate. There's the Universally Speaking pack from the Communication Trust, the Progression Tools from ICANN, and Secondary Language Link. Here are some helpful resources for the different areas of communication. For attention and listening, we recommend the ELCLAN Secondary Language Builders book and the activity planners we showed you earlier. For supporting understanding of language, that ELCLAN Secondary Language Builders book is really helpful, along with Language for Thinking by Parsons and Brannigan, which covers activities for the blank level questions. There's also a Black Sheep Press pack about talking about secondary school or talking about friendships, which is helpful, and the Start Work flowchart that we demonstrated could also be useful here. To develop vocabulary, we recommend the Word Aware resource, again by Parsons and Brannigan. We've also shown you the Collins Co-Build Dictionary, and the Pip St John Pre-Teaching Vocabulary pack is really useful and easily available online. Here are some more helpful resources for supporting grammar, narrative and social communication. You'll see the ELCLAN Secondary Language Builders book has been recommended again, as well as some Black Sheep Press packs. Time Matters is a really good resource for working on time concepts. That's by Doran, Dutt and Pembury. For social communication, the Alex Kelly Talk About for Teenagers is a really great one for working in groups. And the Language for Behaviour and Emotions is another fantastic book by Brannigan, Cross and Parsons. Here are some additional social skills resources. Again, if you search for any of these resources in a search engine online, you will be able to find them to purchase them. Here is a list of other useful websites which you may like to explore following this training. Today has been an introduction into SLCN at secondary. We offer a range of other narrated PowerPoints and online training which dive into the areas of SLCN in more detail, so please do explore these if you'd like to further your knowledge. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you found this training helpful.